Imagine being a young boy just walking down the street when a police officer suddenly peppers you with spray. What if, in that moment, the officer didn't even realize who your father was? A situation that could have ended in a simple confrontation spiraled into something much bigger and sparked an important conversation about race, power, and authority. In this video, we're diving into a shocking story that started with an innocent moment but turned into a moment of tension and reflection. A black boy was pepper sprayed by a police officer on a routine day. But here's the twist. The officer had no idea that the boy's father was none other than the local police chief. How did this revelation change everything? We'll break down what happened that day, how the incident escalated so quickly, and what this tells us about the bigger issues surrounding policing, race, and authority. Stay tuned because by the end of this video, you'll understand not just what went down in this particular case, but why this incident resonates with many people's growing concerns about the relationship between law enforcement and the communities they serve. So why should you keep watching? Because this is not just a story about a single incident. It's a reflection of something much deeper. You'll hear from both sides, and we'll explore what should have happened differently and what we can all learn from this. Let's get into it. It was an ordinary afternoon when the incident unfolded. The young boy, around 15 years old, was simply walking down the street, likely on his way home, minding his own business. No one could have expected what would happen next. As he passed a police officer, a brief interaction took place that quickly escalated beyond what most would consider normal. The officer, without warning, pepper sprayed the boy. At first, it's unclear what exactly triggered the officer's response. Some reports suggest that the officer may have been responding to a suspicion, perhaps the boy's actions, his demeanor, or a perceived threat. Others speculate that it was a simple misunderstanding, a moment of misjudgment. The officer could have thought the boy was being non-compliant or resisting, or maybe there was a lack of proper communication. But what is clear is that things didn't need to escalate. The boy, by all accounts, wasn't being aggressive or hostile. It seems that the officer's reaction was immediate and severe. The spray came out in a burst, catching the boy off guard and causing immediate discomfort. His eyes stung as the chemical irritant burned his skin, and the situation quickly spiraled into a chaotic moment. People nearby watched as the officer's actions seemed more extreme than necessary for the situation at hand. The officer, it seems, acted under the pressure of his training and possibly heightened by the environment. In these moments, police officers are often trained to act swiftly to neutralize any potential threat, but sometimes that urgency can cloud judgment. In this case, the officer's decision to pepper spray the boy without fully understanding the context or the situation may have been an attempt to quickly assert control. But this wasn't just a random encounter. The officer didn't know that the boy he just pepper sprayed was the son of the police chief, the very person who oversaw the department and had influence over the officer's actions. What if the officer had known who the boy was? Would the encounter have played out differently? The tension of the situation grew not only from the physical discomfort of the pepper spray, but from the emotional fallout that followed. It was an intense moment, one that could have ended very differently had there been a moment for clarity, for a better understanding of the context. As the boy stood there, his eyes burning from the pepper spray, bystanders were left in stunned silence. Some people took a few hesitant steps forward, unsure of how to react. A few shouted, demanding to know why the officer had taken such extreme action. But most watched, either frozen or uncertain about how to intervene in such a tense moment. It was clear the situation had caught everyone off guard, and there was a sense of disbelief in the air. How could something like this happen on an ordinary street, in broad daylight? The boy, overwhelmed by the intense sting of the spray, began to panic. His hands instinctively reached for his face as tears streamed down his cheeks. His breath quickened as the chemical irritation made it hard to see, let alone breathe. The boy was in shock, not fully grasping what had just happened to him, and certainly not why it happened. He didn't fight back, nor did he resist in any way. But the force of the officer's actions left him feeling powerless and confused. As his vision cleared and the pain began to subside, his mind raced. He knew something had gone terribly wrong, but what hurt more than the physical pain was the sense of injustice. The feeling that he was being treated differently, perhaps because of the color of his skin. The trauma of that moment would linger far longer than the physical effects of the pepper spray. Meanwhile, the news of the incident quickly made its way through the community. Within minutes, the boy's father, the police chief, was notified. The emotional impact on him was immediate. As a father, his protective instincts kicked in, but his position as the head of the police department complicated things. He couldn't help but feel anger and disbelief. How could this have happened to his son under the hands of one of his own officers? But even more than that, the chief struggled with the weight of responsibility. Should he step in immediately and handle this situation privately? Or would it be better to let the process unfold, given his position? His initial reaction was a mix of shock, disbelief, and a deep sense of personal betrayal. He wasn't just angry for his son, he was angry that his own department, under his leadership, had failed to prevent an incident like this. The situation forced him into a difficult position, balancing his duty as a father with his responsibility as the head of the police force. As he processed the news, the weight of the moment began to sink in. This wasn't just a family issue. It was a public issue now, and it would be up to him to decide how to address it. The boy's father, the police chief, was no stranger to the complexities of law enforcement. Having spent years working his way up the ranks, he had earned the respect of his officers and the community. As the head of the police department, he was tasked with maintaining order, overseeing daily operations, and ensuring the safety of the public. His role was both demanding and influential, a position that required him to balance leadership with accountability. But his reaction to the incident, as a father, was inherently different from that of a typical civilian. While the public's reaction may have been one of outrage, fear, or even calls for reform, the police chief was not only processing his personal emotions as a parent, but also considering his professional obligations. He had seen firsthand the challenges that police officers faced, the pressures they were under, and the difficult decisions they sometimes had to make. Yet as a father, he couldn't shake the anger and disbelief that his own son had been treated in such a way. His initial instinct was to protect his child, but he also knew that his position within the department would impact how the situation would be handled. In the wake of the incident, the chief's response was layered with the complexities of his dual roles. On one hand, he was the authoritative figure in the department, responsible for upholding standards and discipline. On the other hand, he was a father, deeply hurt by the idea that his son had been hurt by an officer, someone under his command. His emotions were torn between his love for his son and his duty to the law enforcement community. The relationship between the police department and the local community played a significant role in the chief's reaction. In some areas, police departments are seen as pillars of the community, trusted to protect and serve. In others, there is a deep mistrust, especially among marginalized groups. The boy's father had worked hard to build relationships within the community, and he had often advocated for transparency and reform. But this incident, with its clear racial undertones, threatened to undo much of the goodwill the department had worked to establish. In light of this, the police chief knew that the investigation into the officer's actions couldn't be handled lightly. The community would be watching, and any mishandling of the situation could erode public trust. The father's role meant he would have to navigate an incredibly delicate path. He couldn't simply let the matter be swept under the rug, especially given that it involved his own family. The optics of the situation were challenging, and the chief had to be careful not to allow his personal connection to cloud his professional responsibilities. Ultimately, the chief's involvement in the response to the incident could sway the direction of the investigation. His position allowed him the authority to push for a transparent inquiry, but it also made the process more complicated. The balance between personal interests and public duty became a constant weight on his shoulders as he made decisions that would not only affect his son, but also the trust the community had placed in him as a leader. In the hours following the incident, the police department was thrown into crisis mode. The moment the news reached the department, the internal review process was set in motion. The incident, now widely discussed, put immense pressure on the department to act swiftly and responsibly. As the police chief's own son had been involved, the situation became even more delicate. The chief, knowing that the public's eyes were on the department, insisted that an immediate investigation be launched to determine exactly what had happened. The officer who had pepper sprayed the boy was placed on administrative leave while the investigation was conducted. This was standard procedure, but it also signaled the department's attempt to distance itself from the incident while ensuring that the facts were thoroughly examined. The officer was interviewed, and any available body cam footage was reviewed to provide insight into the officer's actions leading up to the use of force. The department, under the chief's leadership, was under scrutiny, and how they handled the situation would send a clear message to both the public and the officers within the force. For many in the community, however, the department's response felt like a test of transparency and accountability. Given the history of police-related incidents, especially those involving excessive force, the public was skeptical. Would this be another case where the officer faced minimal consequences, or would there be real accountability? The tension surrounding the investigation was palpable, with activists, community leaders, and everyday citizens closely watching to see if the department would take meaningful action or if the situation would be swept under the rug. The officer's disciplinary actions became a focal point. Initially, there was uncertainty about whether the officer would face any formal charges or be permanently removed from the force. Some felt that a simple suspension wasn't enough to address the severity of the incident, while others believed that the officer's actions were out of line with proper police protocol and training. In the end, after a thorough review of the case, the department announced that the officer would undergo retraining and face a suspension. While this was seen by some as a step in the right direction, others believed it didn't go far enough, considering the emotional and physical harm caused to the boy. The debate surrounding transparency became central to the aftermath. With so many questions swirling about how the police handled the situation, many people in the community demanded full transparency regarding the investigation. They wanted to see the findings, understand how decisions were made, and, most importantly, feel assured that justice was served. In cases like this, where police misconduct is involved, transparency is not just a matter of policy, it's a matter of trust. Without clear communication and openness, the public can quickly lose faith in the system that's meant to protect them. For the police chief, the need for transparency was clear. As someone deeply connected to both the department and the community, he knew that the investigation's outcome would affect not only the trust between the police and the public, but also the reputation of the department he led. The transparency of the process was essential not only to regain public confidence, but also to show that the police department, under his leadership, would not shield its officers from accountability. The incident involving the black boy being pepper sprayed is not an isolated case, but rather one that highlights the ongoing racial dynamics within law enforcement. The boy, simply walking down the street, was targeted by an officer who, without knowing the full context, reacted with force. While it's impossible to know the officer's exact mindset, it's hard to ignore the racial factors at play. The boy's race likely influenced the officer's perception of him and ultimately his decision to escalate the situation to such a severe level. In many cases, black individuals are disproportionately subjected to force, even in situations where other responses might be more appropriate. This reality is a direct reflection of the broader racial tension that exists between police and communities of color. Black people in particular have long reported being treated with suspicion, aggression, and even hostility by law enforcement, often due to preconceived notions or biases about their behavior. The police officer in this case may have seen the boy as a potential threat simply based on his race, an assumption that has been repeatedly shown in studies and statistics on racial profiling. This unconscious bias can affect how officers respond to everyday interactions, turning a routine encounter into a moment of tension or, worse, violence. The incident is part of a larger pattern of troubling interactions between law enforcement and black communities. Over the years, there have been numerous high-profile cases that shed light on the extent of racial bias in policing. From the tragic deaths of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, and Eric Garner, to the shooting of Breonna Taylor, these incidents highlight how race plays a central role in shaping the encounters between police and black individuals. Even in cases where officers may not intend harm, the reality is that racial assumptions can lead to dangerous outcomes. Racial profiling is a pervasive issue within police forces across the country, and it continues to impact the daily lives of communities of color. Studies have shown that Black individuals are more likely to be stopped, searched, or even arrested by law enforcement than their white counterparts despite similar behavior or circumstances. This systemic problem contributes to a cycle of mistrust and fear between police and the communities they are meant to serve. For many Black Americans, each encounter with law enforcement feels like a potential flashpoint, with the stakes of a simple interaction often much higher. The need to address these biases and the broader racial tension in policing is critical. Law enforcement agencies must take steps to actively combat racial profiling, whether through better training, improved policies, or increased accountability. Until racial bias is recognized and addressed within police forces, incidents like the one involving the boy will continue to happen, further deepening the divide between police and the communities they serve. Racial dynamics, as evidenced by this encounter, are not just a reflection of individual actions. They are a symptom of a larger, more deeply rooted issue within the system itself. The media's coverage of the incident quickly made headlines, drawing attention to the police officer's actions and sparking debates across social platforms and news outlets. As soon as the details began to circulate, journalists and reporters took to the story, framing it in the context of ongoing issues with police conduct and racial tensions. News outlets, particularly those focusing on social justice, highlighted the boy's race and questioned whether the officer's response was racially motivated. Many stories asked why an officer would escalate a routine interaction to the point of pepper spraying a child, especially when he didn't appear to pose any immediate threat. In some outlets, the headline focused more on the officer's actions, while others brought attention to the boy's identity and how it tied into broader conversations about police violence against Black communities. Social media played a significant role in amplifying the story, with activists, influencers, and regular citizens voicing their outrage. The hashtag number Justice for Boy's Name began trending, and videos and posts from eyewitnesses flooded platforms like Twitter and Instagram. Many people in the Black community shared their personal stories of racial profiling and police mistreatment, highlighting the painful familiarity of the situation. For many, the incident was another painful reminder of the everyday risks that Black children face when interacting with law enforcement. The public reaction was swift and intense. For communities of color, particularly Black Americans, the incident felt all too familiar. It sparked discussions on racial profiling, the over-policing of Black youth, and the systemic racism embedded within law enforcement. These communities voiced strong condemnations of the officer's actions, viewing the incident not as a single isolated event, but as part of a much larger, deeply entrenched pattern of discriminatory policing. Many questioned whether the officer would face any real consequences or if this would simply be swept under the rug, as has happened in past cases. On the other hand, some members of the public, particularly those who have historically supported law enforcement, defended the officer's actions. They argued that police officers are often put in difficult situations, and in the heat of the moment, the officer may have acted out of instinct to control what he perceived as a potential threat. Some pointed to the fact that the boy hadn't followed the officer's instructions or was acting in a way that could be interpreted as non-compliant. For these individuals, the officer's response was justified, or at the very least understandable under the pressure of the moment. These opinions were often expressed by those who felt that police were underappreciated and too quickly criticized without considering the dangers they face daily. The debate over whether the officer's actions were justified became a focal point in the public discourse. For many, it was about whether the force used was proportional to the situation. Was pepper spraying a young boy an appropriate response, even if he was non-compliant? Or was this an example of overreaction and excessive use of force? Some argued that the boy's race played a central role in how the officer viewed him, fueling the question of whether racial bias contributed to the escalation. Others, however, maintained that race had little to do with the officer's decision and that the incident should be viewed simply as an isolated case of a police officer exercising poor judgment. The media coverage and public debate around the incident reflected the polarized opinions that continue to exist regarding police actions and accountability. While the majority of the public expressed outrage, calling for greater oversight and reform, there remained a strong counter-narrative from those who felt that the officer's actions were justified and that police officers were unfairly vilified. This divide is representative of the larger conversation about race, policing, and justice in America, a conversation that seems far from resolution. From the officer's point of view, the situation likely unfolded very differently than how it appeared to the bystanders or the boy involved. When a police officer is on duty, they are often under intense pressure to make quick decisions in potentially volatile situations. In this case, the officer may have perceived the boy's actions as a threat or a sign of noncompliance, leading to an instinctive reaction of using force. Given that officers are trained to protect themselves and assert control when they feel their authority is being challenged, it's possible that the officer felt the need to escalate the situation in order to regain control. However, this doesn't necessarily justify the extreme measure of using pepper spray on a young boy, especially when there was no clear threat. The officer's training could have played a significant role in shaping their response. Police officers undergo rigorous training designed to prepare them for a wide range of scenarios, many of which involve high-stress situations. One of the core aspects of this training is to ensure that officers are equipped to make split-second decisions that could determine their safety. However, a common criticism of police training is that it often emphasizes control and authority, sometimes at the expense of de-escalation techniques or understanding the nuances of human interaction. In moments where an officer feels threatened, their training might drive them to react defensively, even when the perceived threat doesn't warrant such a response. The officer's training may have also relied on certain biases, whether conscious or unconscious, influencing how they assess the situation. Research has shown that racial biases can unconsciously impact decision-making, especially in high-pressure moments. In this case, the officer might have made assumptions about the boy's intentions based on his race, seeing him as more of a potential threat than he actually was. While the officer might not have intended to act in a racially biased way, their reaction could have been influenced by systemic biases that are present in policing, even in well-meaning officers. Stress and fatigue could have also played a part. Policing is an incredibly stressful profession, with officers often working long hours in high-pressure environments. A police officer who has been on duty for hours, dealing with escalating tensions, may be more prone to react quickly, sometimes without fully assessing the situation. The emotional and physical exhaustion of constant vigilance can take its toll, making it harder for officers to remain calm and consider all the variables before making a decision. Questions linger about the kind of training officers receive when it comes to handling routine interactions with civilians. Are officers taught to recognize when a situation is escalating unnecessarily? And if so, do they have the tools to de-escalate before things reach a breaking point? How well are they trained to read body language, tone, and intent, especially in non-threatening scenarios? And most importantly, are officers adequately prepared to assess potential racial bias in their own actions? These are critical questions that highlight the need for continued reform and improved training, ensuring that officers are not only equipped with the physical tools to maintain order, but also with the emotional intelligence to handle interactions in a way that prioritizes communication over force. The relationship between the boy and his father, the police chief, introduces a unique layer of complexity to the incident. On one hand, the boy is a child who has been wronged, a victim of an aggressive and possibly unjustified act by a police officer. On the other hand, his father holds the highest position of authority within the department, the very institution responsible for policing such actions. This dynamic adds a powerful emotional element to the case, with the chief torn between his responsibilities as a father and his duties as a public servant. As a father, the police chief's natural instinct is to protect his child. The shock and anger he must have felt upon learning that his son was hurt in such a manner, especially by one of his own officers, would have been intense. The emotional weight of the situation is undeniable. At the same time, his professional obligations cannot be ignored. As the head of the police department, the chief must ensure that justice is served, not just for his son, but for the integrity of the entire law enforcement system. The public is watching closely, and any perceived conflict of interest could raise questions about the fairness of the investigation and any potential disciplinary actions. This creates a conflict of interest. How can the chief, someone who is meant to oversee accountability and maintain public trust, objectively handle a case that directly involves his family? The personal stakes are incredibly high for him, but so are the professional ones. It's impossible for the chief to separate the deep emotional impact of seeing his son hurt from the responsibility he has to his officers in the community. This conflict could potentially cloud judgment, and the risk of bias, even if unintentional, is significant. The presence of this familial connection raises critical questions about the course of justice in this case. Would the police chief's influence affect the outcome of the investigation? Would there be any temptation to protect his son's interests or to downplay the severity of the officer's actions in order to avoid scandal? Or would the chief be able to separate his fatherly emotions from his duties and push for an impartial, transparent investigation? The public would naturally be concerned about whether the investigation would be handled with the same rigor as any other case of police misconduct, given the chief's personal stake. The relationship between the boy and his father doesn't just complicate the investigation, it also casts a shadow over the entire process. The community, especially those already distrustful of the police, might question whether the chief can remain impartial or whether the power dynamics in play will allow for the kind of accountability that would be expected in any other situation. Would this case become another example of the system protecting its own, or would it serve as a moment of real reform and transparency? These questions hang in the balance, reflecting not just the relationship between father and son, but the broader tension between personal and professional responsibilities in positions of authority. The incident involving the black boy and the police officer who pepper sprayed him highlights several important lessons about policing and the dynamics between law enforcement and the communities they serve. First, it underscores the need for better training in de-escalation tactics. The officer's decision to resort to force in such a seemingly harmless situation points to a possible gap in training when it comes to recognizing when a situation is not escalating and how to diffuse tension before it turns violent. It's clear that officers must be equipped not just with the tools to enforce the law, but with the skills to assess situations thoughtfully and with empathy. The case also serves as a stark reminder of the deep racial dynamics that continue to influence policing in many communities. The boy's race likely played a role in how the officer perceived him, and this is a reality that cannot be ignored. Racial profiling and bias, whether conscious or unconscious, remain prevalent issues within law enforcement. Addressing these biases in police training and within police departments is essential to ensure that individuals are not unfairly targeted based on their race or appearance. It's also a call to engage more closely with communities of color, building trust and understanding through ongoing dialogue and reform. Furthermore, the incident emphasizes the importance of fairness and accountability in policing. The public's reaction to the event reflects a growing demand for transparency within law enforcement, especially when incidents involving the use of force occur. People want to know that officers will be held accountable for their actions, regardless of who they are or their position within the department. The need for robust systems of oversight and transparent investigations has never been clearer, as they are essential in maintaining public trust. As society reflects on this incident, it is essential to ask, how can we move forward? How can law enforcement become a force for good in every community, ensuring safety without perpetuating harm? It's clear that systemic change is needed, starting with rethinking police training, addressing racial biases, and fostering better relationships between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Accountability and empathy must go hand in hand in creating a policing culture that values people over power. Moving forward, it's up to all of us, community members, lawmakers, and police officers alike, to work together towards solutions that make our streets safer for everyone. When fairness, accountability, and empathy become the foundation of policing, we'll be closer to a society where everyone, regardless of race, can feel truly safe. The question remains,